You felt that he was that good a player and that he had that much respect from the opposition that you were going to win the game.
As a kid growing up, playing for United, playing for England, I loved him.
There wasn't as much football on the telly then, and we didn't come to many games, but if you were to say a name, it would be Bryan Robson.
Bryan Robson was my hero. When I was growing up and Liverpool were winning everything, Bryan Robson gave me hope.
Some of the things that people have been saying about me, I can't believe it myself.
He was insane. The central midfield of the late 1970s through the early 1990s was not a place for the faint-hearted. It was a gladiatorial arena where dominance was asserted through a combination of technical proficiency, psychological intimidation, and visceral physical aggression. Bryan Robson operated in this world like few others could. Known universally as Captain Marvel, he became the longest-serving captain in Manchester United's history. His tenure was defined by a reckless disregard for his own safety and an uncanny ability to influence the outcome of matches through sheer force of will. Yet, here is the thing that separates the great from the greatest. It was not just his own brilliance that made him legendary. It was the calibre of opposition he faced that truly defined his legacy. Robson's career bridged the gap between the muddy, heavy-pitch attrition of the 1970s and the slicker Premier League era of the 1990s. During this journey, he came into direct conflict with a golden generation of midfielders. These were not ordinary players. These were elite competitors who pushed Robson to his absolute limits. When reflecting on a career punctuated by broken bones and lifted trophies, Robson identified a specific cohort of 6 players who stood above the rest as his most formidable adversaries. These men were not chosen lightly. They represent the finest opposition Robson ever encountered. They are the measuring stick by which he gauged his own greatness. The 6 men are Jimmy Case, Graham Souness, Diego Maradona, Steve Williams, Paul McStay, and Lothar Matthäus. To understand Robson is to understand what toughness truly meant in the era that shaped him. To understand toughness in the 1980s is to comprehend a very different footballing culture than exists today. In contemporary analysis, toughness is often conflated with defensive statistics. Tackles won, interceptions made. But in the context of the First Division and international football of that era, toughness was a tripartite composite. First came physical resilience, the capacity to absorb and dispense challenges that would result in immediate dismissal and prolonged suspension in the modern era. This was a time when leaving a foot in was a standard tactical instruction. The reducer tackle was a culturally accepted method of establishing hierarchy early in a game. Second came psychological dominance, the ability to impose one's personality on proceedings. Often this happened through verbal intimidation or the projection of an aura of invincibility. This was crucial in an era where referees offered less protection to creative players. Third came technical endurance, the skill to maintain elite technical execution, passing, shooting, dribbling, while under extreme physical duress and fatigue. Robson was the master of this. He scored goals late in games after enduring 80 minutes of physical battering. Let us begin with Jimmy Case. Among the pantheon of world-class talents Robson faced, it is telling that he consistently cites Jimmy Case as his single hardest opponent in terms of pure physical confrontation. Case was a cornerstone of the Liverpool dynasty of the 1970s and later a cult hero at Brighton and Southampton. He represented the uncompromising, granite-hard nature of English football's engine room. Robson's specific assessment of Case offers a critical distinction in footballing taxonomy. He said, "I won't say he was dirty, but certainly the hardest opponent was Jimmy Case. He could certainly look after himself. He was very clever about it as well." This differentiation between dirty and hard is fundamental to understanding the respect Robson held for him. A dirty player acts with malice. Often they lose emotional control or seek to injure out of spite. A hard player, by contrast, utilises physicality as a controlled professional tool, a means to an end. Case belonged emphatically to the latter category. Standing at a modest 5'9", Case was described as a wiry scouser, yet he possessed a density of strength and a centre of gravity that made him virtually immovable. Contemporary accounts from teammates and rivals alike describe him as tough as teak, a player who did not need to act the tough guy because his physical presence alone communicated the danger. The rivalry between Robson and Case was the localised expression of the broader Manchester United versus Liverpool war for supremacy. During the early 1980s, Liverpool were the undisputed kings of Europe, operating as a relentless winning machine. Manchester United, particularly under Ron Atkinson, were the flashy challengers, capable of brilliance but often lacking the steely consistency of their Merseyside rivals. The midfield was the primary theatre of conflict. Case often operated on the right side of midfield or centrally, which put him on a direct collision course with Robson, whose dynamic box-to-box style naturally drifted toward the left-centre channel. The unbelievable battles Robson references were characterised by tackling of ferocious intensity. In an era before multiple camera angles and VAR, the dark arts of midfield play were essential survival skills. Case was a master of the perfectly timed challenge that took the ball but followed through with enough force to rattle the opponent's skeleton. Case's ability to look after himself meant that Robson could not bully him. Robson, who prided himself on his physical dominance and bravery, famously played through shoulder dislocations, yet found in Case an opponent who absorbed impact without flinching. This created a stalemate of physicality where neither player could intimidate the other, forcing the duel to be decided by footballing merit alone. It is crucial to note that Robson's admiration for Case was not solely based on his ability to tackle. Case was a highly decorated footballer who won 4 league titles and 3 European Cups with Liverpool. He possessed a thunderous shot, often scoring spectacular goals from distance. He had an intelligent football brain that allowed him to integrate seamlessly into Liverpool's pass and move philosophy. To play against Case, Robson had to be alert to his movement and his distribution, not just his tackling. Robson's inclusion of him is an acknowledgement of this duality, a player who could hurt you with a tackle or hurt you with a goal. Now we turn to Graeme Souness. If Jimmy Case was the hammer of the Liverpool midfield, Graeme Souness was the sword, sharp, precise, elegant and deadly. Robson's selection of Souness acknowledges a rival who was arguably the closest mirror image to himself in terms of playing style, influence and complete mastery of the midfield role. Souness was the archetype of the midfield general, a player who dictated the tempo of the game, controlled the emotional climate of the match and executed technical actions with supreme arrogance and quality. The rivalry between Robson and Souness was arguably the defining individual duel of British football in the early 1980s. It was a clash of titans. Robson, the driving force of a resurgent Manchester United desperate to reclaim glory, against Souness, the imperious captain of a Liverpool side that had conquered everything in sight. Souness is frequently described as tough as nails, but his brand of toughness differed significantly from Case's. While Case was reactive and defensive in his toughness, Souness was proactive and dominating. He exerted a psychological stranglehold on matches. Souness intimidated referees, bullied opposition midfielders, and demanded absolute perfection from his teammates. Robson, essentially a warrior captain who led by example, found in Souness a rival who matched his own desire for control. The ding-dong battles mentioned by contemporaries were often centred on the Souness-Robson axis. Tactically, Souness would drift into deep positions to collect the ball from the defence, dictating the play like a quarterback. This forced Robson into a tactical dilemma: press high to disrupt Souness and risk leaving gaps behind for Liverpool's forwards to exploit, or sit deep and allow Souness to control the game. This was a high-stakes game of chess played with studs up. Souness was notorious for his reducer tackles, often executed early in the game to let the opponent know he was there. Robson, however, was one of the few players who could stand up to Souness physically, while also hurting him with runs into the box. Souness respected Robson because Robson refused to be cowed. Robson respected Souness because Souness was a winner who backed up his aggression with world-class ability. While their club rivalry was fierce, the international dimension added a layer of patriotic fervour. Souness represented Scotland and Robson England during a period when the annual British Home Championship and later the Roos Cup were fiercely contested tournaments. Matches between England and Scotland were described as relentlessly attacking slugfests. In these fixtures, the Souness versus Robson narrative was the focal point for the media and the fans. They embodied the national characters of their respective teams. While both were hard, their technical profiles had subtle differences. Souness was arguably the better passer over long distances. Robson was the superior athlete in terms of verticality. His ability to time late runs into the box and score headers was unparalleled. Souness's inclusion in Robson's list is an admission that Souness was the benchmark for the complete midfielder that Robson aspired to, and, eventually, arguably surpassed during the 1980s. The inclusion of Diego Maradona shifts the criteria of the list entirely. We move from the realm of physical attrition to the realm of technical impossibility. While Robson is often associated with the gritty battles of English football, his citation of Maradona highlights his deep appreciation for genius and the unique challenge of facing a player who operates on a different plane of reality. Robson's greatest game in red is widely considered to be the 1984 European Cup Winners' Cup quarter-final second leg against Barcelona at Old Trafford. United had lost the first leg 2-0 in Spain, where Maradona had been influential. In the return leg, however, Robson produced a performance of legendary proportions, scoring 2 goals in a 3-0 victory that overturned the deficit. In that specific 90 minutes, Robson arguably outshone Maradona. However, the inclusion of Maradona as a toughest rival suggests that the Argentine left an indelible mark on Robson beyond that single victory. The rivalry is forever coloured by the events of the 1986 World Cup in Mexico. Robson entered the tournament as England's captain and arguably their most important player. However, true to the tragic narrative of his international career, he suffered a dislocated shoulder in the second group game against Morocco, ruling him out of the rest of the tournament. He was forced to watch from the sidelines as Maradona eliminated England in the quarter-final with 2 of the most famous goals in history, the hand of God and the goal of the century. For a player like Robson, whose game was built on integrity, fairness and physical honesty, Maradona represented a complex paradox. The toughness of facing Maradona was mental. It was the frustration of playing against someone who could manipulate the ball and the rules in ways that no one else could. Robson's inclusion of Maradona acknowledges that while he could physically dominate a Souness or a Case, he could only hope to contain a Maradona. Steve Williams is perhaps the least globally recognised name on Robson's list, yet his inclusion provides the most fascinating insight into the weekly grind of the English First Division in the 1980s. Williams, who played prominently for Southampton and later Arsenal, was a relentless, abrasive midfielder who specialised in disrupting the rhythm of opposition playmakers. While players like Souness were celebrated for their elegance, Williams was the pest or the spoiler. He was described as tough as teak and engaged in a style of play that was constant, nagging and physically draining. He was not a destroyer in the mould of a modern defensive midfielder. He was an all-action agitator who would track runs, leave a foot in, pull shirts and verbally wind up opponents. For Robson, whose game relied on dynamic energy and timing, Williams was the ultimate nuisance. Williams would latch onto Robson and track him every step of the way, denying him the space to build momentum. This type of rivalry is often understated. It wasn't the clash of titans, it was the daily grind of the professional. Williams represented the high baseline of quality in the English League. Robson's selection validates the difficulty of the domestic league. Paul McStay's inclusion is a nod to technical purity and footballing intelligence. Known affectionately as the Maestro, McStay was the heartbeat of Celtic for nearly 2 decades, a one-club man who orchestrated play with elegance and vision. The rivalry between Robson and McStay was primarily international, played out in the intense tribal atmosphere of England versus Scotland fixtures. McStay represented a different kind of problem for Robson, the problem of space and ball retention. McStay was not a physical powerhouse. He relied on reading the game, finding pockets of space, and executing passes that dissected defensive lines. Robson, whose instinct was often to hunt the ball and drive forward, had to be more disciplined against McStay. There is also a shared narrative of loyalty. McStay remained at Celtic despite offers from big European clubs and English sides, paralleling Robson's loyalty to Manchester United during their lean years in the 1980s when Italian clubs were circling. Both men carried the immense weight of captaining massive institutions through transitional periods. Lothar Matthäus is arguably the player who most closely mirrored Bryan Robson's attributes on the continental stage. A box-to-box dynamo who possessed a thunderous shot, incredible stamina, and fierce leadership qualities. Matthäus was the German equivalent of Captain Marvel. Their rivalry was encapsulated by the England versus West Germany dynamic, which defined the late 1980s and early 1990s. In international landscape. In the mid-1980s, however, they were direct competitors for the title of the best midfielder in Europe. The defining moment of this rivalry is, paradoxically, a moment where they did not directly clash on the pitch. The 1990 World Cup semi-final between England and West Germany is one of the most famous matches in English history. However, Robson was absent. He had once again suffered an injury early in the tournament and had flown home. He watched as Matthias led Germany to victory on penalties. This creates a poignant what-if in Robson's career. A fully fit Robson versus a fully fit Matthias in that semi-final is one of the great lost duels of football history. Robson's selection of Matthias is an acknowledgement of the German supreme status, a peer who achieved the World Cup glory that eluded Robson. Matthias was tough in a robotic, relentless German sense. He didn't just tackle, he ran teams into the ground. He possessed an engine that rivaled Robson's. For Robson, facing Matthias was like facing a mirror image, someone who could do everything he could do and do it for 90 or 120 minutes without fading. Robson's respect for Matthias also stems from the Germans' directness. Like Robson, Matthias looked to drive forward and score goals. This made their potential duels end-to-end affairs. The inclusion of Matthias elevates Robson's list to the global elite, placing Robson himself in